So welcome everyone. This is the League of Women Voters California Food, Soil and Ag Team meeting. Oops, more people coming in.
I thought it was the US meeting.
Well, it's I'm running the California meeting, and we're having a joint meeting with the League of Women Voters US Food, Soil and Ag Team meeting as well. And I've also invited other groups so that and we can get as many people here to hear Colin. So we're going to be doing it in a meeting format. You can change your view to a speaker format. So after I give the little introduction, I was just going to go myself. I'm not sure if I can change it to speaker format. Maybe I can, so that you'd only be able to see Colin. So welcome everybody. We have a wonderful, so I live in Encinitas, and in Encinitas, we have a wonderful resource. We have resource. It's also the uh, uh, our Botanic Garden, San Diego Botanic Garden. It used to be Quail Gardens, but they
Yes, I'm here. I'm still here. I'm in the middle of a Zoom meeting, but yes, I'm here.
So Carol, I
Sorry.
have my hand up so that you can remind everybody to please mute
Okay.
as soon as they log on. Okay.
So yeah, so everyone please mute mute themselves, and I will see if I can switch to a speaker format. Do you have anything else, Mary?
No, I think that's it, but maybe just right before we start, because we can edit the video, if you want to do a quick introduction, and then that means we'll just cut everything in the beginning off.
Okay, so we are doing, hi, Mary. So hopefully it is going to change to whoever is going to be speaking. It hasn't done that yet. Let me try that back again. Gallery. So it's and at the San Diego Botanic Garden, we have Dr. Colin Khoury. He is you know what? I'm so sorry. I don't have your whole title in front of me. But they do, not only is San Diego Botanic Garden a wonderful botanic garden, and I highly recommend. And if anybody's interested, you can come because I can get you in. So if you want to come to Encinitas, let me know and I'll get you in. It's a beautiful botanic garden. But in addition to being a beautiful botanic garden, it's really increased the research that they're doing there. And Colin is the director of that research. And I went to a talk that he gave, or that they have a whole series of speakers, but he talked about how they are doing research at the Botanic Garden on agriculture in a warming climate. So today, I would like to introduce Dr. Colin Khoury to speak.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen here then and see if we can get this presentation pulled up. And try to make a full screen. Can I confirm that you can see a full screen presentation at this point?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Success already. So, excuse me. It's an honor to be here with you today. I'm really excited about this. I've chosen, I know that we have a short amount of time, maybe 20 minutes. I've chosen a risky strategy, which is to try to cover actually quite a bit of ground with you, which means quickly kind of throwing seeds out there, if you will. And if that inspires any interest, happy to have further conversations or send you further information. I realize that many of you are subject matter experts in your own right. And so also happy to have a discussion. I suppose at the end is probably a better time for that, Carol?
Yes.
Okay. That said, if something happens that if you see something that doesn't make sense at all, feel free to interrupt me, and otherwise let me know. I may not be able to see you raising your hand or anything like that as I give the presentation. That all sound good? All right. So as Carol mentioned, thank you for the introduction. My name is Colin Khoury, and I direct science at the San Diego Botanic Garden. I actually have a food and ag background and a climate background, and I'm new to the Botanic Garden world, just about 3 years in, coming from agricultural research at the USDA in our national seed bank, which is located in Fort Collins, Colorado. I was there for about 6 years. Before that, I was doing international agricultural research in the CGIAR centers, which are a network of international centers. And I was located in Colombia for many years. And before that, I was at the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, for about 4 years. So quite a lot of kind of international work and then national work. And now I've gone local back in my hometown where I was born and raised. And that's a great circularity for me. So with that, we'll dip in. The discussion of what I understand we're to be talking about today, which is agriculture and climate, and the interrelationships there are so big and so complex that I'm going to choose a subset of that to talk about, which I have more expertise in and have really focused my career on. We'll get there in a minute. But I wanted to start with this absolutely incredible map that came out relatively recently. This is a NASA map. And hopefully you can see this is a world map, and the oceans and the continents. What's interesting here is the green color on top of that. So everything that you see that is green there, which is 12.6% of the global terrestrial area, which is almost 2 billion hectares, or like 5 billion acres, is croplands. And this is from 2019. This is the best, newest map globally of where we grow food. This isn't even rangelands where we grow livestock and all of that. This is cultivated lands. And so, I mean, over 12.6% of all the land we've got. It's such a massive area. In fact, it's the single largest terrestrial ecosystem at this point is croplands where we grow food. And so naturally that is hugely affecting the planet in all kinds of ways, including in terms of climate. Agriculture, as you probably know well, is the single largest source of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It's by far the largest water user in the world, like 70% of fresh water. And it's the greatest driver of habitat and biodiversity loss. So those interrelationships are very, very strong. And I was hired in, they could have chosen, my director could have chosen any sort of scientist to have directed a science department at a botanic garden, for instance, a taxonomist. But he was really focused on making a human impact, and believes that food and ag is one of the most important ways to do that. And so I think that's why he's brought me on, and why I have a big task to do here at the San Diego Botanic Garden. I did want to mention, by the way, sometimes my microphone goes a little wonky and I have to play around. So if you stop being able to hear me or need me to just speak up or anything, do let me know. All right, so what I'm going to focus on today really quickly is my area of expertise, which is biodiversity, crop diversity, and why it is really intricately important centerpiece to adapting agriculture to climate change, and also mitigating climate change through agriculture. And so what is this stuff that we're talking about here? What is this biodiversity? Well, it is the variation within and among plants. I'm a plant person in a botanic garden, so that's what we're going to be focusing on today, that contribute to our food. It is also the variation in and among plants in agricultural systems, in that 12.6% of the global terrestrial surface. And in this incredible symbiotic dualism, that diversity in short form is generally both incredibly good for us, our bodies, as well as for the sustainability, for the adaptive capacity, for the resilience of agricultural systems. And so I'm going to show you a series of photos, particularly from my work in Peru. And this is a mixed agricultural field of quinoa and maize, of corn. So it's two different species growing in the same field. And that allows a degree of resilience in terms of if one of the crops doesn't do as well, the other one does well. And pests have a harder time just attacking one of the crops because you got mixtures. And so it's this incredible thing, biodiversity, that in so many other ways too, but in agriculture, that it's helpful in the field. It's also helpful for the people who eat it. That diversity exists not only at that species level, different crops like corn and quinoa, but also at the varietal level and at the genetic diversity level. And those levels are within crops. And so this is actually hundreds of potato varieties all grown in a community where we're working there in the highlands of Peru. And this is where potatoes come from. They've been cultivated there for over 7,000 years. And typically where crops come from harbor the most diversity in their traditional systems. And I'll try to get, if we have time, a little more into this work, but this is really trying to understand why this diversity still continues to exist and also how it's changing over time. And the guy you see there in the front, he and his brother actually are what are sometimes called custodian farmers or innovative farmers. They cultivate like way more than even their neighbors. And so these varieties are all from him. He and his brother grow actually over 200 varieties on their farm. And that's this is their farm there. And each of those little piles, if your computer screen is big enough to see it, is a different variety being harvested. And so one might ask, why would a farmer grow 200 varieties of potatoes in their field? And that is a relatively extreme version, by the way, of farm level diversity. That is like, I've never seen anything like it, and it's quite a pleasure to see. One of the things that I want to bring up about this is it's not only a human health thing and a environment thing, but it's also a cultural thing. That is, this diversity, which is also often called biocultural diversity, has cultural importance and cultural components to it. So this is an example that's kind of all three of those things at once. The middle there, that's actually a potato too. It's a species, and it grows at the highest elevations in the Andean mountains, and it's quite bitter, and it can be smushed on by women farmers after it's harvested to remove some of the water, and then it's dried and then smushed on again and then dried until it becomes chuño, which is either white or black and can last actually for years. And so it's really a food that gets you through the lean times, and it has its own niche. Culturally, it has its own taste and its own customs around it. And so this diversity is also like very intricately connected with humans and what they, what their cultural context has become. And I'm just going to show you a couple of really just cool, I think, examples. This is just this really tall purple potato that the translation of it in Quechua is scares the thief. And it's planted in the dark. Apparently, the farmer says that it's kind of tall, and in the dark, it looks like a person in the field. And so it would keep thieves away from the field there. And then there's this amazing potato. This is actually a series of varieties that all have these knobs like this. And you'll basically never see these in the United States, or if you do, let me know. This potato translation is makes the daughter-in-law cry. And the reason for that is that in this area, potatoes are typically boiled and then peeled. And they're peeled by hand. And you can imagine that peeling a really knobby potato would be much more difficult if you really wanted to do it well and lose as little amount of potato as possible. And so this is called makes the daughter-in-law cry. Anyway, all of this stuff is biocultural diversity. It's natural, it's plants, but it's also people and the interconnections over hundreds and thousands of years typically. Even in agricultural systems that don't look diverse to us, modern agricultural systems like this soybean field in the Midwest of the United States actually do rely on diversity. And typically the system here is not diverse in space, it's homogeneous and uniform, but over time it's diverse. There's temporal diversity. How does that work? Well, these varieties typically only last a few years, and then the pests and diseases or climate catches up with them. And so plant breeders are continuously breeding new varieties, which the farmers then purchase or adopt, which then go out. So they're uniform in space, but they change quickly over time. So all in all, where does crop diversity exist? It's actually all around us. It's in farmers' fields. That's a kind of an amaranth called kiwicha that grows in the Andes, where we were talking about before. It's all across your supermarkets. It's also in wild spaces, and I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes. And then it's in our conservation systems, that is in seed banks in cold area, in freezers. And I'd like to talk about that for a few minutes. And you may have seen pictures of or heard about this most famous seed bank of all, which is in Svalbard in Norwegian territory in the Arctic Circle. Can I just confirm that the sound's okay? I know I'm moving really fast, but hopefully it's all working out for you all.
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Thanks, Carol. All right. So these are, again, I'm planting seeds here. So a little bit of background as I run through, and a lot of this is my research. Crops, plants that we grow, they all have histories. They all come from somewhere. And that somewhere is not one place in the world, like I was taught in high school, I believe. It is many places around the world where farmers, innovators, thousands of years ago started working with plants and livestock animals and developed this mutually interdependent relationship. And so this is a map of where crops generally come from or where the diversity is. These are our major crops around the world. And so this is another figure that we built. It's all those regions of the world and where the crops come from in terms of where they were domesticated. Like corn was domesticated in Central America and Mexico. What's it, like 1 o'clock there, 12 o'clock? But it's important, eaten in other places. And so this is actually a map of current consumption measured in terms of calories, actually, of the whole set of crops that are eaten around the world, both where they come from and where they're eaten. And you're not supposed to understand this figure. You're supposed to simply understand that we have this highly interdependent, interconnected, modern global food system that stretches back 12,000 years of human history that connects all of us around the world. That is, we all eat one another's plants. And that human story really did, it took 12,000 years to interconnect and interdevelop into this dream catcher or kaleidoscope of incredibly intricate globalized food. Everybody. So this is a picture taken by a friend of mine in a farmer's market, an informal market in Tanzania, East Africa. And I love the picture for several reasons. It's a beautiful picture, but one key point is I can't see any crop in this picture that comes from Africa. So it's not just supermarkets and wealthy people and wealthy countries that are interconnected and interdependent around the world in terms of crops. We've really mixed and matched in all kinds of ways. Good stories, terrible stories, all kinds of things in human history that have created this incredible globalization. So how many plants feed the world is this fun question you can ask yourself or Google, and you'll always see this quote from the FAO where I used to work saying that, 3/4 of the food in the world is from a few different plants, and that's supposed to be a warning. And I've dipped quite a bit into that to figure out how many crops really feed the world. I do think this figure is quite interesting just to ponder. There's probably 350 to 400,000 plant species out there in the world. Maybe 30 to 50,000 of which being more or less edible to humans. How many have been cultivated? Maybe 7 to 10,000 of those. And then how many are really eaten now? Maximum, maybe 350. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunity out there for us to diversify if we'd want to. But I've done some research to try to figure out where our food systems are headed in terms of that diversity and whether we're becoming more diverse or less diverse. And this is a picture of 50 years ago, how diverse our food system is actually globally. Each of these points is a country, and it's actually measured in terms of all the crops that are contributing to calories. And the points that are far out, those are countries that are eating diets that are quite different from everybody else's. And so you can kind of imagine in the middle of the circle is an average diet around the world. That's 50 years ago. If you go 25 years later, this is actually what's happened. And if you go 25 years later, this has happened. And so this is just a couple examples of countries. We have, even in the last 50 years, contracted in terms of the differences between us around the world and what we're eating. It's actually an ironic story. We become more diverse actually at national levels in terms of the major 100 or so crops that we eat. That is, in Thailand, for instance, that used to eat 50 years ago almost 90% rice in terms of its calories, now eats not only rice, but also potatoes and wheat and other major staples like that. So it's actually diversified, but that also means we're eating more and more similarly as we all eat kind of the same global story. And so that has real implications about what we're interdependent on and what really needs to work for all, what, 9.2 billion of us, and coming every day more. This, again, I apologize. I know I'm moving really fast, and I can't break this down entirely, but this is basically the change over 50 years. On the left side is absolute change, and we're eating more food around the world than we did 50 years ago, which is good in many places. The major foods like rice and wheat and sugar and maize haven't changed that much. They're still the most important to us. On the right side is the relative change of how much each particular crop has changed in 50 years. And basically the global story is the oil crops have had enormous positive growth in 50 years. Positive in terms of their success, in terms of human health and environmental sustainability and all kinds of things. It's a very mixed story there. What has been at the cost is traditional roots and tubers and cereals like cassava and sweet potatoes and yams and millets. So that's our globalizing system. You're going to get this presentation so you can read this cartoon at length if you like. I love that there used to be cartoons about this produced in the 70s in an Australian newspaper. So I've also done a lot of work on what's been happening with this diversity and how much have we lost. And there's also this famous quote from my field, which is we've lost about 3/4 of it in the last century. And I've been trying to unpack that and really figure out if that's true. And let me just stop for a second. Again, I want to reiterate, this is diversity that was developed with people and plants working together, and it's thousands of years old. It's our biocultural history, and it really is irreplaceable in the sense that unless we really figure out how to recreate something entirely from scratch, like a mastodon from scratch, it's the same thing with these varieties or these species. Once they're gone, they're gone. And so to me, it seems like a sadness personally that you would lose over 100 years, for instance, 3/4 of the diversity that took 12,000 years to develop.
Wow.
And so how do you do this kind of research? Well, you need info from the past, like data from the Hopi fields in Arizona, and then you need to be able to go back to those places or have data from the present and compare those. There's a cool book from a mentor of mine named Gary Nabhan called Where Our Food Comes From that you can check out his attempts to try to do these comparative studies over time. But I'm going to show you just 3 pictures and tell you, so I spent 2 years basically deep diving into this and trying to figure out the global story through what's called a literature review, just every piece of evidence out there, anything I could find, and synthesizing that in a paper that's open access if you want to read it. It's broken down now, the results, into 3 categories. The first one is these traditional farmer varieties, what we call land races or heirlooms in the United States. And I love this picture from Wisconsin Historical Society that this is from the turn of the century, and it's like the vegetables are so huge, first of all, which is just an amazing picture. But the story of landrace loss is massive. It is true. I don't know if it's 75%, but a huge amount has been lost even in 100 years. And that is really the modernization of agriculture that has been primary to that. Particularly the movement from so-called traditional agriculture or peasant agriculture to modern systems, which are very different and mechanized, less people working in them, more chemically based, all kinds of things. But it's not just that. It's basically the entire human history. It's economic development, it's migration, it's demographic change, it's people moving to the city. It's absolutely everything that goes into this huge diversity change around the world. The second story is about how diverse and what has happened in our modern agricultural systems like this one. And that story is actually quite complex. In some ways, in the last 50 years, since modern varieties have been bred, 50 to 70 years, some systems have become less diverse over time, unfortunately. And this is really like how many varieties are available to farmers. And that has a lot to do with the consolidation of seed companies. We have many less seed companies out there than we did 50 years ago, and they're becoming more powerful. And we can talk more about that. But there's also another story, which is that in certain contexts, you can really have a lot of diversification or rediversification of these systems. So for instance, there's good evidence in the Netherlands, tomato varieties, modern tomato varieties, that actually they're much more diverse than even 2 decades ago. Why? Well, there's at least 2 reasons. One is because of taste, that the market started to demand better tasting tomatoes, and that made breeders start to look for different diversity to get there, more different types of tomatoes as well. The second thing is actually the organic sector that pushed for diversification in tomato varieties in the Netherlands, because they needed more varieties that fit different niches to fit that organic sector that wasn't as homogeneous. I mentioned wild spaces. This is a true picture, by the way. This isn't photoshopped or anything. This is from the Great Sand Dunes National Monument or National Park in Colorado. And these are wild sunflowers, non-domesticated, but cousins of our cultivated sunflower, which was domesticated here in North America. And this is a really interesting group of plants, these wild cousins, that are increasingly actually important to modern agriculture, because they haven't undergone the bottleneck called the domestication bottleneck that went through when we started to domesticate these plants, to work with them and cultivate them. And so they have actually generally more pest and disease resistance, more tolerance to cold or heat or drought or salt. And so in terms of actually climate adaptation, if you can bring those genes into modern agriculture, which is what modern plant breeders are now doing in force, then you can diversify agriculture through new wildness. And that's quite an interesting thing that's been going on, yeah, for 50 years, but even more in the last few decades. Okay, so I don't always speak this fast, by the way. Carol might know that I'm actually a pretty quiet speaker, but I'm moving fast here. I'm going to start to wrap up in a way by talking about what I think research is interesting going on, and then what actions are going on that are important to if you want to be thinking about this diversity and how it can impact agriculture in a positive way in terms of climate or other things. And so one thing is that I think that really learning these big trajectories about, sorry?
Never heard of me.
Oh, sorry, I'll mute some people.
Okay. One thing is really still understanding change, particularly where crops come from, because that diversity is so important. If you want to talk about where's the diversity that's going to save potatoes in the next 100 years, it's in the Andes of Peru. Other places too, but that's where the mega diversity is, because that's where it came from and where it's been cultivated for some 7,000 years by many cultures. And so there's interesting work going on, including work that I'm fortunate to be part of, honored to be part of, community level research of talking about this change. And this is a community workshop where we've divided the varieties grown in that community into 4 sections. The top left one is varieties that are grown by many families over large acreage. The top right is many families over small acreage. The bottom left is few families but big acreage, and then the bottom right, where most of them are few families and few acreage. So they're basically rare. And then the ones that don't have any potatoes are just lists, just names. Those are the ones lost that people still remember, but that are gone. And so that's really interesting to ask those questions of why are these things disappearing, and what is happening in these communities. And also the other question, maybe even more important, why can you still find 6,000 varieties of potatoes in this valley in Peru? And why do people want to keep them around? And how do we do better at that? This is in Spanish, but maybe you get the picture, or if you're interested, we can talk more. It's also really important to understand the big global system, and I'm honored to be part of a lot of global tracking about what's happening with apples versus melons and watermelons and grapes, and the different number of varieties that are coming out and their genetic diversity and how much are held in seed banks and all these sort of things. And so this is a big effort that came out about a year ago, which you can see here, or if you want to get in touch, I can send it to you. It actually does have some particular vignettes in it particularly about climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, and the value of crop diversity in working and dealing with those things. And so if that's interesting to you. I also want to say that like there's still so much to learn, and I am like, my edge of excitement is I'm obsessed with biomolecular or biochemical diversity in crops. Actually, it's a new frontier for me. So just to show you how little we know, there's probably at least 30,000 molecules in food, biomolecules, and we really know only really what they are, a couple hundred of those. And so there's a big global effort going right now called the Periodic Table of Food that's about uncovering that dark matter of nutrition, that thousands of molecules that nobody has typified, nobody really knows what they are. And this is just such a cool example of early research from this, this initiative, which is all open access. It's really meant for the world. It's about building capacity in laboratories around the world. Okay, so this is just a study of common green vegetables, and the number of biomolecules in common of all of those common vegetables is on the right, 202.
Wow.
Now, the number of totally unique across those crops molecules in broccoli, almost 1,000. To me, it's mind-blowing how little we actually still know about what we put in our bodies. And thank goodness it generally is just good for us to have this diversity, because it's amazing how little we know. By the way, these molecules, like so many of them, are actually protective chemicals for the plants, because plants can't run away. And so they have to protect themselves from herbivory. And in this incredible, to me, it's just mind-blowing that those chemicals are often healthy for humans. All right, so now I'm going to turn to conservation, essentially. What do we do about this diversity, and how can we protect it and mobilize it? And I wanted to mention that botanic gardens, if you don't happen to know them, are an incredible place that has plants, but also has crop diversity. And so this is pictures from our garden. We have a fruit and nut, tropical or subtropical fruit and nut garden that has bananas and pomegranates and dozens of other crops. And many gardens have this sort of thing. We also have a seed bank and a laboratory. This is our small seed bank. Some gardens like New York or Missouri, the bigger ones have much bigger versions of this. But here we try to preserve in controlled conditions for decades or hundreds of years diversity, including crop diversity. We're not the only ones. Actually, the Botanic Garden world is huge. It has many thousands of organizations. And so this is a map essentially of botanic gardens that are part of a system called Botanic Garden Conservation International. They're ones that are really working on conservation and doing a lot together. Point is, they're everywhere. They're probably near you, wherever you are, and they're doing pretty interesting work. I'm new to this again, but I've kind of caught the I've caught the bug. I really love botanic gardens and all that they're doing. In terms of crop diversity, they're one half of the puzzle of a bigger system that's crop gene banks or crop seed banks. And I mentioned I worked in our central repository in Fort Collins, Colorado. That's the biggish circle that's kind of in the, looks like the northeast, but it's actually kind of, well, no, it's anyway, it's there, there-ish. You can see the Canadian gene bank up above in Canada there. The size of the circle is the number of samples that are held, or the number of accessions, how big the collection is. And the point is, there's also this incredible network of national, international, regional, and local seed banks or gene banks around the world that are focused on conserving this crop diversity, the 12,000 years of human history that is now mostly in seed banks rather than out in farmers' fields. What is that about? It is about conservation, kind of a Noah's Ark thing, as we are losing so much because of modern life, but it is also about that diversity being important. That's where plant breeders come to get diversity to make new varieties. And so it is a cyclical system. We also have these backups, which is a really great thing, like here in Svalbard, in the Arctic Circle, where seeds are held in the case of disasters. And this isn't about the end of the world, actually. This is because all systems, all seed banks have their own disasters of the electricity going off or a hurricane coming through or anything else. And so backups of this precious diversity are really important. there's a lot of work around the world that I'm also part of and happy to share. Is about strategizing about this diversity and who's got it, and where the gaps are in our conservation, and what we could do about that to work better together. And this is a global example, a lot of global planning, for instance, with chili peppers. And here's a more regional example in the United States, and something we call the North American Fruit and Nut Tree Crop Wild Relative Working Group. Wonky long title of really exciting, like excited people. This is a small short list of hundreds of people who are excited about wild cousins of important crops, and these wild cousins are native to the United States. And so those are actually, that's a wild plum and a wild peach that are native to California, which we were lucky to collect and conserve, and now in our garden and seed bank. And that's a wild walnut as well from California. That's a really neat program. My main point is here, there's actually a lot of efforts of thinking about this diversity and trying to work together. You can't work by yourself on this if we're really going to do a global job or a regional job. Final points, other things, including I think what Carol probably was thinking about when she invited me to give this talk. There is a lot of climate change research going on, and we're lucky to be part of that in terms of adapting agriculture. And sunflowers are this precious resource we have in North America of our domesticate, probably the most important domesticated crop coming from the United States. We tend to think about it baseball and that's it, but it's actually a very important oil crop around the world. Places like Ukraine and Southern Africa and Australia and other places. And this research, supported by the National Science Foundation, is about trying to understand how this diversity has changed over decades, but also primarily to re-diversify through plant breeding and modern genomics. Happy to talk about that. Did want to mention that there's innovative efforts, I think, to engage the traditional knowledge holders, the Native American communities, in resilience work and adaptation work. And this particular project here in San Diego is funded by the EPA, which I believe Mary had mentioned had worked at EPA before, well, earlier. And this is really great support, I think, funding that comes from this recent administration that is about climate, and it is recognizing that disadvantaged communities are inordinately burdened by climate. And so there's a specific amount of monies of supporting disadvantaged and tribal communities. And so our work there is working with those communities to figure out what their worries are about their culturally significant plants, which include crops, but also medicinals like this. This is yerba mansa, which is a medicinal native, and then figuring out what we can do about it, which might mean restoring degraded areas where wild harvesting happens, or it might mean starting to cultivate these plants because the wild areas are so impacted that you really need to start growing them instead of cultivating or pulling them from the wild. A final note, or second penultimate note, is that training the next generation feels to me like one of the most important things. And we are really excited to be part of that in many ways, including a National Science Foundation grant called RAMP, which includes 3 other gardens. And it's all about training young folks, particularly that come from demographics historically excluded from STEM and first generation scholars, and getting them excited about plants, plant science, climate, ag, all this stuff. And we just completed year 1. These are our 2 folks that worked with us in the garden in year 1, and we're starting year 2 with a new cohort. That's them being very excited to be in a laboratory pipetting. My final note is that all of this stuff is, to me, it's so fascinating to focus on diversity. I really believe that it's critically important, and it's one of the pieces that's going to get food through climate change. It's also a sad story. It has a lot of loss to it, and it's important to find ways to have fun with what diversity is still there, but also primarily, like, if it's just science and just wonky, nerdy people doing their thing, it's not enough. We have to have outreach and education. Like, somehow we need to be thinking about ag and food and climate and also diversity. And so we're trying to take our steps here in the San Diego region. This happens to be an endangered dish, only eaten in Ensenada in Baja California. It was mostly eaten by kids in the elementary schools. It's called cono de frijol, which is basically like an ice cream cone looking thing with beans inside of it. And it's just it's just cool. I love it. And it's disappearing out of schools and kind of declining. And so trying to have conversations about that and why that happens. But primarily, like, why am I talking about this? This is my final note. I think that affecting people, now I'm going to talk to you all, which of course you all know so much more about how to get people engaged and how to vote and all of that. So, certainly I'm kind of preaching to a crowd that knows better than I do. But my sense is that a great way to have a conversation or start to have a conversation is with what people care about. And so if we want to talk about food and we want to talk about San Diego, among the foods that probably tie everyone together in San Diego, that is, everyone gets it, it's kind of our food, are tacos. And so we have this taco diversity initiative going on that's about celebrating that diversity in San Diego, but more than anything, it's just about getting people to think about diversity. So how many species are in these tacos, and how many different tacos, and how many varieties of chili pepper are in the sauces, and where are the traditions coming from, and all of that. And the aim is that eventually someone sitting down, even me as a scientist who does this every day and forgets most days, sitting down to lunch, will think about for a minute, what is that diversity and why is it important, and what can I do to support it? All right, so that's it. I think I went over. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions, happy to follow up and with you independently or whatever you like. And thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you, Colin. That was just amazing. I'm going to switch it back to the meeting view so we can see people. I was just blown away by your talk. I thought it was fantastic. And I want to just say that, I was thinking my takeaway, and you can correct me, is that crop diversity is critical to mitigating climate change effects on agriculture. And so looking at saving different diverse plants, and then also using wild plants to rewild and get the genes that are important for adapting to different climates. Is that one issue that you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I think you did a good job of summarizing. So crop diversity, I really do believe, is one of the pillars of both adaptation and mitigation of climate change. Adaptation meaning that as climate moves, you need that diversity to move crops, for them to evolve. Mitigation, because actually this diversity could actually help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in several different ways. To have agriculture function and have this diversity around, we also need to protect and conserve wild spaces. And that's where that wild relative thing is quite interesting. That is, the future of food also means we need to protect wildness.
Well, thank you. I'd like to open it up now to questions from the group. Does anybody, and you can unmute yourself and ask questions. That, it'd be nice if you could put your hand up. I know that putting a hand up is different now if you've gotten the new Zoom things. So Mary, you want to start us off with a question?
Sure, and thanks so much. It was really incredibly fascinating, and also thank you so much for your work, because it's such important work. My question was, very early on in your talk, you mentioned about agriculture being, I don't know if it was a driver or the major source of climate change. And I'm curious about that because sort of been one of our arguments, but you hear numbers tossed about, and everyone's so focused on transportation and oil and gas and electrifying cars. And so how does agriculture end up being the driver of climate change?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so thank you. And I'll speak to it, but I'm not an absolute expert on it. I do believe I can look up the research and send it along, but if you include agriculture writ large, which also includes ranching, so both croplands and ranching, it is the biggest greenhouse gas emission source. And a major reason for that is actually expansion of agriculture and cutting down of forests and other carbon-rich areas to turn into agriculture. And so it has several ways. There's also, of course, in agriculture itself, tilling the land and all of that. There's particular crops like rice that are major emitters of the worst greenhouse gas emitters, which are methane rather than carbon. And so it's multifaceted. It's expansion, it's certain crops, and then it's just the size of agriculture. Again, that 12.6% of the Earth's surface is agriculture that makes it so easy to make it a powerful contributor to these global biogeochemical changes.
Great, thank you. I would love to see the reference, because we're always looking at, we cite the IPCC, we tend to cite, and we always cite the very reliable sources. So we will stick with IPCC, UN, FAO, all of those organizations in our work, in our publications. So thank you. If you would send that along, that would be great.
Sure. And I should have said it's definitely a major source. I might have misspoke by saying the major source, but it is a major source.
Yeah, I always see the numbers somewhere around 36% for worldwide food production. So
yeah.
And, if you
Thanks.
look at global issues where, other countries, there's less transportation and more agriculture. So you're gonna get the percentages skewed that way too. And so I just wanted to first ask, are we gonna be able to get I'm recording the talk, but can we get your slides to pass around? Because I know a lot of people are very interested in looking up some of those slides that you can't see as well from the talk, from the recording.
Sure thing. Yeah, of course.
Anne, you want to say something?
No, I was just, when we talk about agriculture's impact, shouldn't we also include transportation of the food around? Because that's got to be a huge part of agriculture. Mary says we're not going to do that. Why are we not going to do that?
No,
Mary?
it's actually a very small part. There's a sort of a seminal study on this. If you look at Nemechek and Poor's data that came out, and they really broke down where the greenhouse gases are coming from, and transportation turns out to be like a really minuscule part of it, and most of it comes from the actual production of food. So transportation is separate, but it's a very, very small part.
Interesting.
Yeah, I understand that to be the case too. Just one addition, if you don't mind, Mary, to that. And as a consumer, I think there are some choices that can be made. If you all are thinking about where you should target your efforts, yeah, I agree. It might not be the most important, but as a consumer, just as an individual, there's a pretty big difference, for instance, of fruits and vegetables that are shipped by shipping. And that includes, for instance, bananas, versus stuff that are flown and refrigerated flights, which can often be things like asparagus from Peru. And so if you learn up enough about it just individually, I think that there are some effect you can make personally in the choices you make about what fruits and vegetables and other things you eat.
Okay,
Yeah, and we do always support we always support buying local, right? Supporting your local farmer, supporting your local organic farmer.
Okay, Sharon, would you like to ask the next question? You're still muted. Here, let me see. Did I? Yeah, are you there, Sharon? Here, let me.
Shall we take Elizabeth while you guys figure that out?
So Sharon, I'll look to see if I can unmute you, and we'll go with Elizabeth right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that information. It's just fascinating. I was really intrigued by like the potatoes in Peru, 600 species and so many lost. Just curious, like what other, was that like the biggest number of different biodiversity in what species? Are there other places? Like what other crops have that level of biodiversity or cultivar diversity?
Now I muted myself. Thanks. I love the question. It's also remarkable that we don't actually have great numbers on how many varieties ever existed and still exist of things like our most important crops like wheat and rice. But rice is considered to probably be the one with the most varieties. And that would be over 100,000 varieties of rice. that have been out there. And the International Rice Center that's located in the Philippines holds over 100,000 samples. That's not exactly the same thing, but quite a lot. And then wheat is up there at 50,000, 60,000 varieties and such. So cool. Yeah, we can answer your chat question. Yeah, so actually clonally propagated crops like potatoes and bananas have more like 5 to 10,000 varieties that have been developed over time. So you might compare it to some of those cereals, it's actually low on the end of the spectrum. Major point though is that's a ridiculous amount of diversity, and it's so wonderful that some of it still exists out there.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, I could go on, you know, but it's fascinating. I wonder why, but anyway,
I'm happy to answer that real quick.
okay.
Go ahead.
The why is basically different needs. But I mean needs both in terms of people and place. And so agriculture, local adaptation agriculture, that is systems in which farmers save seeds and grow them again and all of that. So it's basically at the community level. Maybe you share with the next community, but it's not buying from across the world from a company that adapts. Every year there's adaptation going on of those varieties. They're a little different as they save the seeds and grow them again and all of that. And so little by little, you get different stuff happening, and especially in places with varied environments. So Nikolai Vavilov is a guy to look up if you're interested in any of this. Vavilov, V-A-V-I-L-O-V. He's considered the grandfather in our field. He was a Russian scientist, and he was one of the great travelers of his time. And he went to all these places, and he started to see, and he actually was one of the first people that started to propose, oh, agriculture probably came from here and here and here and here, not just one place. And where he saw them happening was mostly mountainous areas. Mountainous areas that have a lot of topography, a lot of climate differences, even between one valley and the next, a lot of cold versus heat and changing all the time. And so like a community in one valley is actually very different than the community even 10 kilometers away. And there you get diversity that really develops out versus a very homogeneous environment.
Okay, so Sharon's question was, would it be appropriate to ask the local regenerative farms to grow local veggies? Is that right, Sharon? Yeah.
Yeah, is that a question for me or more around your advocacy?
It's for you,
for myself.
Yeah.
And in terms of adapting agriculture or doing something about climate and agriculture in particularly, or just generally?
And I think it's just in general.
Yeah, I personally, so I'm not a scientist in this, and Mary, it sounds like you all have read up on some of this stuff. The impact of local versus further away is multifaceted. It really depends on what you're measuring and what your issue is. Like for instance, sometimes in some contexts, it could probably be less water use if you purchased in something from somewhere else than if you grew it in the desert here in Southern California. So it's not a one size fits all, but I do believe like people need simple guidelines. Like food is so complex that generally if you're buying local, generally your impacts are going to be more positive and less negatively impactful. I definitely believe that in general, but there are caveats, and it really depends on what your main focus is. There was a pretty cool study that I was a little bit involved in the UK about their sourcing of their fruits and vegetables, and could the UK become self-sufficient? And there's trade-offs. I mean, it would be very hard to have a well-rounded, really diverse modern diet in the UK, for instance, totally local. And so could you grow more, but also like make your purchases wiser? And also if you're a wealthy country like the UK or maybe the United States, could you help where a lot of this food is now coming from, which is overseas? For instance, us in Mexico, could you help, or in Central America, could you actually help some of those systems become more sustainable by investing actually in them? So those are some of the interesting questions that I think get asked around that, or they're interesting to me.
Okay, so Mary, you get the last question. But you're muted.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you again, Dr. Khoury. I was just thinking I wanted to round up and come back to the United States because you had mentioned, talked about how land use change is a major driver of climate change. But here in the United States, and we know much of that is happening in South America and really more in the Southern Hemisphere. But here in the United States, we're losing ag land to development. So our goal is more, so that's not what's driving our climate change, right? It's more of the concentrated animal feeding operations and the livestock. So I'm wondering about the competition between animal ag and plant ag. And one point that has been put out there, a proposal, and they're doing it in some parts of Central Valley, is when you take ag land out of use, putting it into an easement so you can put it back into its natural state, which takes a lot of effort. It doesn't happen overnight. So if you could just speak a little bit about what's driving it here in the United States in terms of agriculture and climate change.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, it sounds like you all are doing your homework or have done your homework, and I only know what I know, which is a slice of that, since I'm not a full-time focus on it. But I think you're on the right track, and it is different in the United States. It's not so much about expansion, for sure, only in a few small places. The animal agriculture, what's nice about, if you want to focus on food and climate, there is so much to focus, like choose your stuff and what battle do you want to fight. There is so much evidence that if we could just transition to a somewhat more plant-based diet, that it would have so many positive effects. That is tough stuff, I think, to talk like directly about for people, but it is just happening. I think it's really happening, like watershed happening over 10 years, just the amount of products that are out there and the availability and the consciousness. And so I don't know if it's actually the most important thing to be talking about right now, because I think it is sort of happening. Maybe it's not, I don't know. But it is hugely impactful, I think, that way. There are certain cropping systems, including in the United States, that I understand are particular, I should say, agricultural systems. Again, the animals most of all, but also crops that are inordinately producing of greenhouse gas emissions, and so that could be another area of focus. Although it's tough. You need solutions that are you need farmers to be able to switch to something else, and so you can't just tell them they can't do it anymore. I mean, I do think the policy change is interesting, that California often leads, which is, you create the policy and then they have to switch, but hopefully you facilitate that switch so that people don't just lose their livelihoods. Anyway, that was an insufficient answer to a wonderful and big question that I would love to know what you think.
That was great. I was just sort of reminding everyone our work is here in the United States, but at the same time, what we do in the U.S. impacts are huge globally. So, Carol, you're muted still.
My dog and husband came in wanting to talk to me. So, so thank you so much. I think this was a really amazing presentation. I really, really appreciate it. It just I love all the little seeds that you spread of ideas, and that I think that we will definitely be sending around your slides as well as the recording. So and anybody that wants to come see the Botanic Garden, please let me know. I can get you in. Also, I want to put in a thing for city tacos in Encinitas. Also it's also in San Diego. They have very diverse tacos, and including vegetable-based tacos. So anyways, thank you all for coming, and especially thank you, Dr. Khoury.
I just wanted to mention that in the US, libraries are increasingly starting seed libraries as part of library services.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, great stuff. Nice local movement stuff. Thank you. This was really an honor. Carol, I'll pass you the presentation so you can share it out if that works fine.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm happy to be in touch if you want to further.
Okay.